The leaves are turning, the weather's cooling down, and that can only mean one thing. Something fantastic is coming, something is on its way. No, it's not fall. No, it's not Halloween. No, we're not getting close to Thanksgiving and to Christmas. It's time for the Fall Classic, the World Series. And since its inception, 115 teams have been able to call themselves World Series champions. But of those, who is the best?
The 1995 Atlanta Braves.
That one's not important. Tonight we find out this week on Convince Me. Listener, viewer, please excuse that music switch up there. I'm not re-recording it. Welcome to another episode of Convince Me. I am Andy Rutherford, joined as always by Mr. Brian Bennett, Mr. Casey Elrod. Gentlemen, how goes it this week?
It's always a lovely time in Choptober.
It is.
Is it?
I think we should pull a fast one.
We should
a curveball and just talk about the '95 Atlanta Braves.
Yeah, that's the key that we're going to do tonight. Me and Bennett
those are better
the greatest team of all time is the '95 Braves. So that's what tonight's show's about. It's a group effort.
We're going to discuss the '95 Braves.
What about the '92 Braves and the '96 Braves? The '99 Braves.
Hey, it ain't our fault. It's not our fault that Minnesota Twins decided to turn on the air conditioning every time they went up to bat in the Metrodome. It's not our fault.
In Minneapolis.
It was at 91.
October. Not really. Anyway, welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. This is another week of Convince Me Show. There's going to be plenty of bantering back and forth. Probably plenty of shots taken. Before we get into all of that, here is your weekly shield. Follow us on all the social medias to find out what's going on. Facebook.com/Convince Me Show every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Central Time. You will see a preview portion of each week's show in video format. Be sure you're over there to check that out. Twitter @Convince Me Show. Occasionally, we decide we want to be lazy and not pick the topic for that week's show and let you guys pick the topic for that week's show. And when we do those polls, those can be found over on Twitter. Instagram. We don't do anything special on Instagram, but you should follow us there anyway. Convince Me Show. Of course, YouTube, tinyurl.com/Convince Me Show. Every week, every episode is up there in its entirety with the video format. And of course, the podcast drops wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts every Wednesday morning. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, rate, review, all that good stuff. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell the drunk guy down on the corner. Check us out every week. The more you listen, maybe one day we will be good enough to get sponsorships and we can make the show better. We're not close, but we might be one day, and it starts with you. So spread the word, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get into this show tonight. Gentlemen, as we speak, the ALCS, full transparency, we're recording on Monday night. The Rays went up 2-0 in the ALCS an hour or so ago. The Braves and the Dodgers are playing in the NLCS right now, and all that's well and good. Championship series are great, but what that means is we're 2 weeks away, a week away from one of the greatest events of the year, the World Series. Now, I got to say, gentlemen, I'm a little disappointed in you two because we decided we were going to talk about the best World Series teams of all time, and both of you come back to me with Yankees teams. I'm a little disappointed in that.
Yeah, I'm disappointed.
That's most of it, by the way. That's about half of the World Series champions are Yankee teams.
It is true.
There's
about 4 other teams we could have picked, and they were all Yankees teams.
I was fully expecting a 69 Mets versus an 86 Mets, and then that would have been really hard for me to judge. But
You can thank Bill Buckner for one of your wins.
you know, craziest thing, Pete Rose left him tickets to the WrestleMania in Boston a few years ago, WrestleMania 14, but Buckner couldn't bend over and pick them up. If you want to catch that story, go listen to our Switch Hitter episode. That was a good one. Speaking of that episode, shout out to the guy that hosted that show, Kurt Conger, who may be the only person that fully enjoys this episode as one of the Yankee fans I know. But anyway.
You better enjoy this. This is going to be one of the last times that we talk good about the Yankees.
Yes, the last time.
And we could have put in that
cheaters.
Big Red Machine Reds team. And I only say that to say, rest in peace to Joe Morgan. Fantastic player. What I grew up on, fantastic color analyst. And from everything I've heard about the dude, just an all-around good dude. So our thoughts go out to his.
You knew it was Sunday night. You knew it was Sunday night when you heard Joe Morgan's voice in the summertime and the fall. You knew that it was Sunday night.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm done with 2020. If 2021 could go ahead and get here, that'd be great.
Didn't Whitey Ford die like a few days ago too?
I think so.
Yes.
I mean, that's
he sure did.
Not a good year.
Not all, but we're going to go back to some good years tonight. I know Bennett likes to take us back a lot of times. Tonight, Elrod's taking us back to a time we grew up in, 1998. And Bennett's taking us back to
great year
where our parents weren't even thought of yet. We're going way back with Bennett, 1927. So, gentlemen, are you ready?
Are you ready?
Let's do it.
It's a DX reference.
Hold on just a second.
Crazy question do we have tonight?
How many members are in DX?
I don't know.
Oh, right. We got
what?
DX.
Here we go. It's going to be simple. And it involves a player on the team that Elrod is arguing tonight.
Oh, no.
Boo.
In clutch, Mr. November. Derek.
David Justice. Oh, dang. Dang.
One of the most overrated players of all time. I am sorry, Mr. Kirk. But Derek Jeter was a great player, but if he didn't play in New York, would he be the name he is? And the answer is no.
Yes.
But he was clutch in the World Series. Closest without going over, unless you both go over. It's a simple question. Derek Jeter's lifetime batting average in the World Series.
All right, locked in.
Yep.
What we got?
Wow.
308.
The correct answer is 321.
Oh.
World Series batting average, meaning Mr. Bennett was the closest. So, Bennett, will you be going first or will you be going second tonight?
I believe I'll defer this time. I want to hear about these 98 Yankees.
Bennett wants to bat in the cleanup spot, and he's got Elrod to lead off. So, Elrod, take me back 22 years, 1998. York Yankees.
Feels like 98, doesn't it? 98 was a great year for this country. It wasn't a great year for Bill Clinton, but it was a great year if you're a Tennessee sports fan. You got the Vols, 13-0 perfect season. You got the Lady Vols. It was the decade of the Vols. But it was also the decade of the New York Yankees. Right, tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about the 1998 New York Yankees. The 98 Yankees, in my opinion, not off of this research that I'm going to bombard you with tonight, but based on common sense, are not only the most complete team in baseball ever assembled, they may be the most talented, top to bottom. We'll get into that later on. Each of the 25 guys on this roster run had a role, and they executed it to perfection. They had a great combination of youth, experience, power, speed, right hand, left hand pitching. Let's look back. When you think of 1998 in baseball, you think of one thing. You think of the home run race between McGwire and Sosa. Everybody's juicing up, but the Yankees. The Yankees were definitely not juicing that year because really nobody had over 30 home runs other than Bernie Williams on this team. They did it by small ball. They did it the way baseball was meant to be played. And besides the hitting, this team was loaded with high-quality pitching. Andy Pettit, David Cohn, David Wells, El Duque, Orlando Hernandez. Think of the pen that this team had. This Sandman, Mariano Rivera. The bench, the 98 Yankees may have had the best bench of all time in terms of quality of players and the stats that we'll talk about tonight. The 98 Yankees were a team that did not have an individual agenda. It was all about the team. There was no infighting. It was all singular-based focused. And there's a reason why this was the case. And it goes back to the heartbreak from the previous year that we'll talk about tonight that propelled the 98 team to be as good as they were. So, right, we're going to talk about the regular season record that this team had, 114-48. Now, the choking Seattle Mariners broke this record a few years later, but in typical Mariners fashion, didn't do crap in the playoffs. So this team is the undisputed best team of all time based on the record. No one comes close to the quality, to the wins. Completeness is the word that we'll focus on tonight.
Two things I want to point out in what you just said. Number one, you said that the Yankees were not juicing. And then the first pitcher you name is Andy Pettit. That's number one.
That year he was not juicing. Later on he did. Later on.
But the second thing is awful bold of a Braves fan to call out a Mariners fan for not getting it done in the playoffs.
Hey, we got a championship. We got something to show for it. They don't.
Ooh.
I mean, anyway, Bennett. Elrod took us back 22 years. You're going to take us back 93.
Nearly 100. Yeah.
3 years. You're 1927. Tell me about that year, the team in pinstripes.
All right. Before I do, I'm going to ask you a very, very simple question. And that is, what sport are we talking about tonight?
Baseball.
Baseball. America's great pastime. It's truly a sport full of history that really dates back to the 1800s. If you think about it, we've had about 150 so odd years of baseball. So in those 150 years, baseball's seen its fair share of great moments, like Andrew Jones hitting 2 home runs in his first 2 at bats in the World Series on October 20th, 1996, which was my birthday. That's a great moment in baseball. You also have its fair share of great players and great teams. And, we're all big baseball fans. We've got a lot of friends that are big, huge baseball fans. And oftentimes, we might ask, who are some of the greatest baseball players of all time? Consistently, you'll get answers like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Ted Williams, Roberto Clemente, so on and so forth. There's, it's pretty, those are pretty consistent names to start with. It definitely goes on from there. Then you may ask, well, what's the greatest baseball franchise? And this is where the answers might differ a little bit. You might say it's the Yankees that have the best franchise. We have some friends that may say it's Boston. We have friends that may say it's the Cubs. We don't have any friends that would say it's the LA Dodgers. But I'd fancy you would say it's the Mets. And as me and Elrod will probably try to argue that it's the Braves. Now, let's go a little bit further and let's say what is the greatest World Series team of all time? You've got a few to choose from. You do have the 75 Reds. You also have the 76 Reds too. They kind of get left out too, but they were almost just as good in my book. You've got the 1929 A's who knocked off those mighty Yankees teams that were so dominant in the 20s. You've got the 1907 Cubs with their, I think, 1.73 ERA they had that year. Hey, what about those 86 Mets? They took the NL East by 21 and a half games that year. And like I talked about before, there's several Yankees teams that we could talk about. There's the 32 Yankees, the 39 Yankees. One of my favorites, the 61 Yankees. There's a whole lot of history behind that team. And you've also got the 98 Yankees. They're in there somewhere. I'd put them maybe third or fourth. But really, there's one team that stands out as the greatest World Series team, and that's the 1927 Yankees. They absolutely dominated baseball that year, and they boasted a lineup that was so lethal that they were nicknamed Murderers Row, which is probably one of the coolest sports nicknames of all time, if you think about it. This team right here was like absolutely loaded with talent from top to bottom. And we'll get into kind of some of these mind-blowing stats that they had tonight. But just know that the talent and the level of play that they had that year would be very, very, very difficult to match today. And tonight, we'll get into that, and we'll touch all the bases on what made the 1927 Yankees so great. And I'll convince you that this is the best World Series team of all time.
All right, gentlemen. Well, compelling opening arguments there, and I cannot wait to dive into this with a little more detail, weigh the scales, and see which one we come up with. And if you are looking forward to that and you're watching us on Tuesday night on Facebook, then I apologize, but you're going to have to come back tomorrow. The full episode will be up on YouTube. The full episode will be in podcast form wherever you get your favorite podcasts. But this is where the Facebook preview ends. For those of you currently on the podcast or YouTube, we will be right back right after this. Don't touch that dial. And we are back. And gentlemen, let's hop right in. We're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to look at what these teams had, and then we're going to look at what these teams did. But I want to look at what they had in segments. And the first thing I want to look at is their position players. Their guys playing every day, guys batting every day, guys playing the field. Bennett, I want to hear about Murderers Row. Tell me about the everyday position players for the 27 Yankees.
Right. I would love to tell you about Murderers Row. I was excited about this part. It's maybe my favorite part of my favorite show. We'll see. One could probably argue that the 27 Yankees had quite possibly the most feared lineup of all time. The first six batters, batters 1 through 6, were known as Murderers Row. Now, that Murderers Row name kind of predates this team. It goes back to kind of like pre-Babe Ruth era for the Yankees. They They kind of got this nickname back in the I think 1918 or something like that. But the name popped up again in 1927 just because this team was just like so stacked and so lethal, and it really stuck with them as the true murderers row, if you will. Now those first six batters are Earl Combs, Mark Koenig, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Bob Musial, and Tony Lazzeri. Now, the owner of the Yankees at the time, Jacob Rupert, he's most credited with assembling this team together, but it's also speculated that the GM at the time, Ed Barrow, he could have also played a factor as well as putting this team together. But let's just dive right in and talk about these core six members of Murderers Row and how they murdered pitchers' ERAs, if you will. Haha. That's my pun for the show.
But
In the one spot leading off was Earl Combs. He was a center fielder. He was like your prototypical leadoff guy. Um, Good hitter, speedy, played in the outfield, played center field. He batted a 356 batting average, which wasn't even the highest on the team. And he had 231 hits, which led the league. Not bad for your leadoff man. Batting behind him was Mark Koenig. He was a shortstop. He was the switch hitter of the team, and he was a very underrated player. That's a name that kind of gets lost in the shuffle a little bit with some of these other huge names that are on here. He greatly benefited from batting in that number 2 spot right after Earl Combs and right before a couple other guys I'm about to talk about. But he batted a 285, which is very respectful and it's by far the lowest batting average on the team. But I would take a 285 if I was a professional baseball player. And he also scored 99 runs, which ain't bad. Not bad for your number 2 guy. Batting third is a guy some of y'all may have heard of, played in right field, named Babe Ruth, the great Bambino, Sultan Swat. What's scary about this is this is a prime Babe Ruth. This is him at his absolute best. This was Babe Ruth's best year. He hit 60 home runs this year, which was first, and it was number 1 in the league. He had 158 runs, which was number 1, 192 hits, 165 RBI, 137 walks. He got walked a lot, so it's impressive that he had 60 home runs. He got walked the number of times that he did. His 137 walks is obviously first in the league. He also batted 356. His on-base percentage was a 486, which was number 1. And his slugging percentage was 772, which was also number 1. So you've got Babe Ruth. He's pretty much sweeping every category with the number 1 spot here. It's an absolute ridiculous season that Babe Ruth had. Everybody remembers the 60 home runs. But when you look at some of his other numbers, like he just ran away with all these stats this year. The only guy who actually gave him a run for his money was the guy that batted right after him, and that was Lou Gehrig, the first baseman. He was actually named MVP this year, which we'll talk about that, why he got MVP and why Babe Ruth didn't get MVP this year. But for right now, we'll talk about how this was Lou Gehrig's first big season, if you will. I know he would go on a few years later to win the Triple Crown, but in this 1927 season, he hit 47 home runs, which was only second to Babe Ruth. He had 173 RBI, which led the league. He batted 373, and he had 52 doubles, which also led the majors. Right after him, you had Bob Musial, second baseman. He hit 337, which is pretty good. 8 home runs, 103 RBI, and was second in the league with 24 stolen bases. Last guy, Tony Lazzeri, second baseman. He hit 18 home runs, which you're like, okay, 18 home runs. That was third in the league. So you've got Babe Ruth, number 1, Lou Gehrig, number 2, Tony Lazzeri, number 3. Top 3 home run hitters of the AL that year. He also hit 309. So 5 of these 6 guys all hit over 300 for the year. He had 102 RBI, which almost every single one of these guys had over 100 RBI. And he tied for third also with 22 stolen bases. Now, I kind of threw a bunch of stats at you, and they're numbers, so sometimes it's kind of hard to process all these numbers. So I want to put these stats into perspective and show how some of these stats ranked that year in regards to MLB. WAR for positional players: Babe Ruth, number 1, Lou Gehrig, number 2, Earl Combs, number 6, and Tony Lazzeri, number 8. So they had 4 of the top 8 for the WAR for that year. Batting average: Lou Gehrig, number 4, Combs, number 8, Ruth, number 9. Combs and Ruth both had a 356. I don't know why they put 8 and 9. It should have been 8 and 8, but whatever. On base percentage: Babe Ruth, number 1, Lou Gehrig, number 3. Slugging percentage: Babe Ruth, number 1, Lou Gehrig, number 2. Runs: Babe Ruth, number 1, Lou Gehrig, number 2, Combs, number 3. Hits: Combs, number 2, Gehrig, number 4. Doubles: Gehrig, 1, Musials, 5. Triples: Combs, number 1, Gehrig, number 2. Home runs: Ruth, 1, Gehrig, 2, Lazzeri, number 8, but third in the AL. RBI: Gehrig, 1, Ruth, number 2. So when you take all these like hitting stats for these positional players and look at it in perspective, the 27 Yankees absolutely dominated every statistical category possible. And I'm sure if you were a pitcher in 1927 and you roll into the Bronx or the Yankees come to your town, I'm sure it was probably a bad day at the office for you.
We're hoping it was your off day in the rotation, I'm sure. Elrod. Same team, different generation.
Yeah, a few years later, just a few. So later on the show tonight, Rod, I'm going to talk to you about the 97 Yankees. It's important in terms of position players. In 97, Brian Cashman is the luckiest person alive. And I'll tell you why. Brian Cashman takes over as GM of the Yankees in 98, and he still has that role today. He inherited the knock on the later Yankees in the 2000s is even today's Yankees is, they just go out and they go hunt for the big free agent, big fish. That's what they do. They've got a huge payroll. That's what they do. Well, that's not how the Yankee dynasty in the late 90s was. They had their free agents later on, but for those first couple of years, they were built on homegrown talent. And that's what Cashman received from Bob Watson, who retired in 97. The first thing Cashman does after the Yankees were defeated in 97 and when he took over is he made a few free agent signings. He added Chili Davis, he added Luis Sojo, and he added the 2 most critical components to this team: Chuck Knobloch, who you're a big fan of, right? I know, and Scott Brosius, who, when you look at this lineup that we'll talk about here in a minute, may seem insignificant, but he was the World Series MVP of 1998 with this lineup, which is absolutely amazing. So let's start behind the plate. Jorge Posada. This year, he had 17 home runs, 63 RBIs. And I misspoke earlier. No person on the 1998 Yankees had over 30 home runs. In fact, nobody had over 29 home runs. This is the oddity of 98, how you had this huge surge in home runs all around the league. And the World Series champions this year just go totally against the grain. And the top hitter that year was 26 home runs. And we'll talk about Bernie Williams here in a minute. At first base, Tino Martinez. Reliable Tino Martinez batted .281, 28 home runs, 123 RBI. We talked about Chuck Knobloch. He was a second baseman. He had 17 home runs, batted .265. Scott Brosius played 152 games and had a .300 batting average for the season. The captain, Derek Jeter. I know you think he's over. for the late 90s, early 2000s that had more consistent numbers than 1904 RBIs. Bernie Williams won the Silver Slugger in 98, batted .339. RBI. Paul O'Neill, probably my favorite Yankee. I don't know why I like Paul O'Neill, but batted .317, 24 home runs, 116 RBIs. One of your favorites, right? Darryl Strawberry, former Met great, 24. This is his last season with the Yankees. He had the colon cancer diagnosis later on in the season. He didn't play any in the playoffs due to his diagnosis, but he did have 24 home runs. When we talk about the bench, we talked about how this Yankee team probably had the best core of bench players of all time. Tim Raines, former Baltimore Oriole, batted .290, played 109 games. Joe Girardi, the backup catcher for Jorge Posada, batted .276. Luis Sojo, Chili Davis, Ricky Leday. That's a name you haven't heard in a long time. Ricky Leday. And one of the oddities of this 98 Yankees team is Homer Bush, who appeared 71 plate appearances and batted .380. He's kind of the unsung hero of that core, but he batted .380. Top to bottom, these numbers are just so consistent from position 1 to position 9. Usually in baseball, once a pitcher gets past the 5 or 6 hitter, they can breathe a little bit. Like the 8 and 9 player is not going to take me deep. Okay, they're just not. But with this Yankees team, you had to be mindful of 1 through 9, and if they pinched hit, you had to be concerned about them as well. And this just goes to show that completeness is a word I want you to focus on tonight. We hadn't even talked about one of the players, Mike Lowell, who was a hero of that 2003 Marlins team, started out as a New York Yankee and started out in 98. He batted .267 for the season, but Shane Spencer is another name that Shane Spencer had one of the biggest runs of all time when he was called up in late September. He had 3 grand slams, batted .373. I believe he became a Met later in his career. There's a lot of New York Met, New York Yankee interplay between these two franchises. But that is the core for the position players. As you can see, you don't have murder's row, but you've got death by 1,000 cuts. And that's what you have with this Yankees team, top to bottom.
Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for any technical difficulties there. All right, I think your internet also agrees with me that Derek Jeter is overrated, because once you went into that, you froze up for a little bit there. So we didn't hear your argument there, so I'm going to assume he's still overrated. And don't get me wrong, when I say Derek Jeter is overrated, I am not by any means saying Derek Jeter was not fantastic, that Derek Jeter is not a Hall of Famer. He absolutely is. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at his numbers overall, he was not as great as a lot of people would say that he was. And if he played in Colorado,
he's the best captain of all time in baseball.
Yeah, that's arguable. But, I mean,
Best captain of all time.
If he played in Minnesota or Colorado and put up the exact same numbers he put up in the Bronx, I don't necessarily I think he'd still be a Hall of Famer, but I don't think he's the name that everybody thinks he is.
I think you're absolutely right, but he's just was in the right place at the right time, and there was no denying that he was a captain of one, probably the greatest baseball dynasty of all time.
I mean, and I agree, and I don't mean that to take from him. My thing is, he's not as good as a lot of people say he is, but that's not to say
I would agree with that. I totally agree with that.
But here's my question: if he is in one of these clubs that's outside of a major city like New York or LA or something, and he puts up the seasons that he still has, does he eventually become a Yankee?
If George Steinbrenner opens his pocketbook, probably so. which he probably would have.
Yeah, fair point. So, all right, that's the position players. That's the guys playing every day. But a lot of times it's the guys that don't play every day that make the most difference. And that's the guys that are taking the mound, whether to start the game, to finish the game, or somewhere in between. Elrod, tell me about the 98 Yankees pitching staff.
Well, we talked about earlier that in 98, you had the explosion of the home run. And ERAs were going up all over baseball because of the explosion of the home run. But however, the 98 Yankees 3.82 ERA was the best in baseball. Mel Stoudemire took over as pitching coach in 96. From 95 to 96, Mel Stoudemire brought the Yankee ERA down over a point. And it kept on going down during his tenure. The number 5, let's go through the 5 main starters for this team. The number 5 starter was El Duque. That's how good this team was. His ERA was 3.13 and he won 12 games. Not too shabby for your 5th starter. I would say that the lead starter this season was David Cone. He appeared in 31 games, 3.55 ERA, 120 games. A second, David Wells. David Wells, this is his season that he had his perfect game. It's also the same series that that the Baltimore Orioles and the New York Yankees got into their big slugfest. It's the same series that he had his perfect game. Number 3, Hideki Uribe. He had 13 wins, had a 4.06 ERA. Andy Pettit. I know he was on the juice later on in his career, but there's no evidence whatsoever that he was on the juice in 98. He won 16 games, had a 4.24 ERA. Where this team excelled in terms of pitching is in its pen. This pen that the Yankees had rivals any bullpen in the history of Major League Baseball. I'm going to start out just by talking about the obvious one, Mariano Rivera. Mariano Rivera was a young buck in 98. In 97, he was vilified a lot by the New York media. He had just taken over the closure role in 97 from John Wetland, and he blew the Indians game. He cost them a World Series in 97 by his performance. And a lot of the New York media was like, is this guy for real? Is this guy going to be our man going forward? And he obviously was. So we'll start out. He had 36 saves. He had a 1.91 ERA. So he answered his critics in 98. And this was the start of the Sandman. But let's talk about Graham Lloyd. Graham Lloyd had a 1.67 ERA, appeared in 50 games. Another former New York Met, Mike Stanton, appeared in 67 games, although he had a 5.47 ERA. But let's talk about Mendoza. Oh, Mendoza. He did, I believe he actually appeared as a starter in some games, but he had a 3.25 ERA. Collectively, the bullpen anchored by Rivera was 28-9 in 1998. And Mariano got his sea legs late in the season, and he was such a force that this is where you've got teams that once you get into the 8th and 9th inning, they knew the game was over. They knew Mariano with his cut fastball. You were not. If the Yankees had a 1 or 2 run lead, it's over. Give it to him. Get the heck out of the way. They hear the Sandman song coming on. It's over. So when you couple this great offense with the caliber of and just the quality of the starting pitching with this lights out bullpen, just completeness. We talked about this earlier. Just completeness with this bullpen and this pitching staff.
Bennett, you told me about the fantastic lineup of the 27 Yankees. Tell me about their counterparts and the guys in the bullpen for that team.
Yeah, it really wasn't just the positional players, that murderer's row that drew fear in their opponent. The pitching staff also, they held their own just as good. I don't think they get near enough as credit. They're overshadowed by the murderer's row. But if you look at some of these and what some of these gentlemen did this year, um, they don't have the big names. You don't have a Babe Ruth top pitcher. You don't have a Lou Gehrig top pitcher. But what they were able to do collectively as a unit was really quite impressive. They gave up the fewest earned runs at 494, the third fewest home runs, and the third fewest walks. And they were led by their ace, Wade Hoyt. He had a career year in 1927. He was 22-7. He led the league in winning percentage, and he tied for the lead in wins. And he finished second with a 2.64 ERA. So that's a guy who did pretty dang good. And it's not really a huge name, but this guy is a Hall of Famer. Next, you have there's some interesting stories behind some of these guys too. And the first one I'm gonna get to is Will C. Moore. Will C. Moore isn't a name I don't expect any of you guys to just know off the top of your head. But this guy, he bursts onto the MLC in 1927 as a 30-year-old rookie. And he goes out to be one of the best relief pitchers in 1927. He boasts a 19-7 record, and he led the league with a 2.28 ERA. He also had 13 saves, which tied for first in the league at the time. Another name, Herb Pennock, which we'll talk about him a little bit more later on. But at the time, he was one of the MLB's premier left-handed pitchers. He finished 19-8 and had right at a 3 ERA. To me, this next guy is the most interesting of the bunch. His name was Urban Shocker. First off, what a name, Urban Shocker. He's interesting because he is actually one of the last players to be legally allowed to throw a spitball. It was banned in 1920, but he was grandfathered in. So he was throwing that spitball. And I think a lot of his success came from him throwing a spitball and people not wanting to, man, I don't want to touch no spitball, you know. He went 18-6. He was third in the league with a 2.84 ERA. And he did all this while he was very, very, very ill. There's records on there saying that he had to sleep sitting up because he had this heart condition which would not allow him to sleep laying down. And also, unfortunately, this would be towards the end of his career because he untimely passed away the very next year at only 37 years old. Dutch Ruther went 13-6 with a 3.38 ERA. That's one of the higher ERAs from the bunch, which I'll take a 3.38 ERA as being one of the higher in the bunch. And the reason why his was a little bit higher, he was kind of on the tail end of his career. It was his final season, but he did throw 3 shutouts and had 12 complete games. So, you know, he was still a workhorse for the team, even though he was on the twilight of his career. And last but not least was George Pipgrass, who went 10-3 in his first year in the starting rotation. He had played a couple years before, but they finally kind of eased him in kind of midway through the year into that rotation. Altogether, they combined for a 3.20 ERA, which was the lowest in the majors. And they combined for 11 shutouts. And they led the majors in wins with 110 and the fewest losses with 44. And they had 6 pitchers that had 10 or more wins, which was a pretty big feat at the time. It doesn't sound like so much now, nearly 100 years later. And like I said before, Wade Hoyt would be inducted into the Hall of Fame, and also Herb Pennock would also join him in Cooperstown. So they had 2 gentlemen here make it to Cooperstown.
All right. Well, gentlemen, as we know, you could have the greatest assembly of players put on a team, but a lot of times those strategic decisions can make or break a season. I'm looking at you, Grady Little, for keeping Pedro Martinez in the game. Um, but the manager, the guy making the strategic decisions, the coaching staff, whether that be your bench coach, your pitching coach, your hitting coach, but mainly and probably most importantly, the guy that takes all the praise or all the blame, the manager. Bennett, tell me about this 1927 Yankees coaching staff.
Really, the only person to mention is the manager. There wasn't necessarily so much a coaching staff like we know it today, but they did have a heck of a manager. They were managed by Miller Huggins, who himself was a former second baseman for the Reds and the Cardinals. He played second for the Reds from 1904 to 1909, and then he hopped over to the Cardinals from 1910 to 1916. And he actually managed the Cardinals from 1913 to 1917. So he was kind of like a player coach for them, which is I've always been interested with the aspect of the player coach. I think that's very interesting. After 1917, he makes the move to New York, and in 1918, he starts to manage the New York Yankees. And he would go on to manage them from 1918 to 1929, which we know was some dang good years for the Yankees. He would win 6 pennants, and he won 3 World Series. And we don't know a whole lot about Miller Huggins, but we knew though he was a very, very well respected manager by the team, by his players. He was described as an intelligent manager that understood the fundamentals of baseball, kind of like George Knox did in Angels in the Outfield. He emphasized those fundamentals.
Fundamentals, middle of the season.
Oh man, what a great line. Now it's interesting too to note that towards the beginning of his tenure with the Yankees, he emphasized speed. He emphasized like the hit and run and the slap hitting, if you will. That was kind of his MO through his first years. But then something changed. Something came about that made him kind of rethink his philosophy. And that thing that come along was Babe Ruth. When Babe Ruth comes to New York, he's like, I need to shift gears a little bit. So he changes his emphasis more to power, and his main thing is to not give away outs. So power hitting and the fundamental still not giving away the outs. So he would recruit these power hitters, and then for his pitching staff, he looked for consistent pitchers. They may have not have been the huge stars, if you will, like your Grover Cleveland Alexander or like a Cy Young or finished with 1,413 wins, which 90 something years later is still good for 23rd all time. The Yankees dedicated a monument to Huggins in 1932, which would be the first of many to be included to Monument Park. The Yankees also named a field after him in their spring training facility. And in 1964, he would be elected into Cooperstown in the Hall of Fame on the Veterans Committee.
Very nice. Elrod, what about the coaching staff for the 98 Yanks?
Yeah, so to understand the coaching staff for the 98 Yankees, you got to go back to 96. George Steinbrenner hires Joe Torre. Now, we know Joe Torre as the 4-time World Series champion manager. But at the time, Joe Torre was a manager that had been fired 3 times. from his previous stops. New York media was up in arms over this hire. One tabloid newspaper had a 14 or 16 font black copy. Clueless Joe was the name Joe Torre was hired in New York. Well, it was Joe Torre that had the last laugh. Joe Torre coming in to his role as a Yankee manager was 109 games below 500 as a manager in professional baseball. So Joe Torre assembles a staff that includes Don Zimmer. Now, most people know Don Zimmer from getting a headlock by Pedro Martinez and he's getting the crap beat out of him in Fenway Park, but he was a great bench coach for the Yankees. Mel Stoudemire, we mentioned him earlier, was the pitching coach. He lowered the ERA from 4.65 to 3.84, but almost a full run from when he was hired initially. Chris Chambliss. Now, a lot of people don't know who this is, but he was the first base coach for the New York Yankees. His name is attached in baseball history in 1976, I think it was, in the ALCS. He hits a walk-off home run. Everybody's happy, so they all charge on the field. They want to hug him as he's going around third base. This was such a mob that he forgot to touch home plate, and this created the Chambliss rule. And what that is if a player doesn't touch home base, they're out. Now, the other team could have challenged this at the time, but the game was over. If it would have been a total riot to get all these people off the field back into the stands. So that's his connection to baseball history. The core Yankee bench coach, manager, Joe Torre, pitching coach, hitting coach, first base coach, and third base coach, Willie Randolph, another Met connection who was done wrong by your New York Mets and fired later on. You don't agree with me on that?
In games.
Well, the core of that staff was the same in 96, 97, 98, 99. There was one change in the staff in 2000. But for 5 seasons, you had a complete staff, and it never changed. Usually, like the Houston Astros or LA Dodgers, if they win a World Series, a team is going to come poach one of their position coaches to be manager. That didn't happen with the Yankees, probably because George Steinbrenner was paying his staff more than some teams' managers. So they had no reason to leave. What gets lost with Joe Torre is he was a 6-time All-Star manager, but a lot of people forget that he was a very good baseball player in his own right. He was a 9-time All-Star as a player in professional baseball. So we talked about completeness. This is going right along. The Yankee staff in 98 was just as complete as its lineup, as its bench, as its starting pitching staff, and its bullpen.
All right, guys. Well, as we know, winning a World Series is fantastic. That October run that every team looks forward to, but there's 6 months of work before that to get there, and you have to show yourself. You have to do well enough in I almost said 162 game season, but I don't guess that was the case. 1927, but a long, grueling season to get to the postseason. So, Elrod, tell me about what the Yankees did in the regular season in 1998.
Yeah. So I'll go back to 96 real quick. 96, the New York Yankees were the underdogs against the Atlanta Braves. They were the upstarts. They won the World Series in 96. 97, they were the odds-on favorite to win the championship. However, they run into the Cleveland Indians and Manny Ramirez and Jim Thome. Mariano Rivera blows the lead. New York goes up in arms. That brings us 98. 98, Cashman brings in Brocious. He brings in Knobloch. The 98 season did not get off to a good start. Even their amazing record, where they won 114 regular season games, the 98 season started out kind of rocky. They lost 3 straight, and 4 of the first 5 games they lost. So when you do the math, if they lost 48 games, they lost 4 in the first 5. That shows you how good they had to play later on to make that up. The 98 Yankees, of all the great Yankee teams that came before it, the 27 Yankees, the 32, whatever, the most wins ever for not just New York Yankees at the time, but for Major League Baseball, 114 and 48. Set the American League record for wins, a record that would stand until the Mariners broke it, but we won't talk about them because they're a bunch of chokers. They won 116. Doesn't matter, though. You got to win the ship. New York Yankees would go on to win 125 games when you count the postseason games, a record that still stands today. The previous record holders, the 86 Mets, and the 1906 Chicago Cubs. Later on in the season, Yankees are rolling. They bring up Shane Spencer, who hit 8 home runs, including 3 grand slams in September to make his way onto the postseason lineup. In May, you have David Wells with his perfect game. Then you have the melee later on. George Steinbrenner was asked going into the playoffs, how do you rank this team with your previous years? Where does this team rank in Yankee allure? And he kind of put the pressure on his team when he said, this was as good a team as he's ever seen. There's never been anyone any better. So you got George Steinbrenner, the toughest owner in sports, kind of saying, this is the best team ever. And that's a lot of pressure going into the 98 playoffs. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. They won their division by 22 games. Joe Torre's manager of the year. Just completeness. We'll talk more about their postseason run here in a second.
Bennett, tell me about the 27 Yankees regular season.
Well, to put it in the words of one Mr. Forrest Gump from my favorite movie, if some of y'all don't know, to quote him, he said, Mama always said that you have to put the past behind you before you can move on. Very wise words from Mr. Forrest Gump. And that's exactly what New York had to do after a disappointing loss to St. Louis the year before, 1926, in the World Series. So they kind of had a bad taste in their mouth. So they come out the following year swinging, literally. They come out swinging. The regular season for the Yankees in 1927 I could really sum up this whole thing in one word, and that would be domination. But I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that domination. They went 110 and 44, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there have only been 4 teams that had more wins than that, 2 of which played in 162 games. So I'm going to throw those out. So it only puts 2 of them. I think if you give this squad here and how dominant they were 8 more games, we may be talking about them as the greatest winningest team of all time. But we can't. That's all speculation. So we'll leave it as it is. What we do know is they outscored their opponents by nearly 400 runs. And collectively, they hit a 307 batting average. They led the American League in nearly every category. We touched on that a little bit before. And they set major league records with 975 runs, 158 home runs, 908 RBI, and a 489 slugging percentage. Um, talk about those 158 home runs for a minute. There's only one other team in the whole entire majors that hit over 100, and that was the New York Giants. So they hit 58 more home runs than the second best in the major leagues. The pitching had the lowest ERA in the majors. They had 5 pitchers that had ERAs at or below a 3.00, and it was really almost unfair to many other teams that had to play them. Really, if you look at it, one example I had of their just sheer dominance that they had actually came on Independence Day of that season. They're playing a doubleheader against the Washington Senators. Game one, they win pretty easily, 12-1. Not bad, not bad. They come out the second game and beat them 21-1. So for the 2 games, they win 33-2. That kind of gives you an idea of how they just came out and stomped a mud hole in all these other teams. Afterwards, one of the players for the Senators, Joe Judge, said this: "Those fellas not only beat you, beat the tar out of you, they tear your hearts out. I wish the season was over so we wouldn't have to play them anymore." That is a direct quote from a player from another team. And I think the rest of the league kind of felt the same way. They just might not have went on record saying that. Um, touch a little bit more about Ruth and Gehrig. These two men put up 2 of the best seasons of any player in any season in MLB history. They combined for a devastating 1-2 punch in that 3 and 4 spot in the order. And if you look at some of these, they finished first or second in the league in several categories. They finished either first or second, one behind each other. They flip flop, but they finished 1-2 in home runs, RBI, total bases, and extra base hits. Gehrig batted 373 with 47 home runs and a major league record 175 RBI, which broke Babe Ruth's record for the most RBI in the season. Babe Ruth, not to be outdone, batted 356 with a major league record 60 home runs, which broke his own record of 59. And of course, he had a 164 RBI, and he had a league leading 158 runs. Now, those 60 home runs was more than any other American League team had combined. Babe Ruth hit more home runs by himself than any other team in the American League had combined. That is crazy. And his 60 home runs stood until obviously 1961, when he had the great race between Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle. If you kind of think about that today, for one player to hit more home runs than any team had combined, you would have to hit 300 home runs, and you have to hit 300 home runs in 154 games. That's how absurd that stat is for Babe Ruth to hit that many home runs. The Yankees, they wall up the competition, and they finished a whopping 19 games over the second place Philadelphia Athletics. And just out of sheer curiosity, if you want to know how they fared against their rival Red Sox, 50, that's putting on a buffoon. So after we're slated to meet up against the NL's best team, which was the Pittsburgh Pirates in the 1927 World Series.
World Series. Well, let's hop right into that. I want to look at these postseason runs by both of these teams. Now, granted, Mr. Elrod's probably going to have more to talk about in this segment than Mr. Bennett, just due to the format of baseball being different in 1927 than it was in 28. 1927, there was no big long playoff run. You won the pennant for the league. You went to the World Series. So, Bennett, tell me about the 1927 World Series.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the 1927 World Series. You're absolutely right. You laid it out correct of how that went down as opposed to how it goes on today. I've got a little timeline here of how this World Series played out. And I'm going to start with Tuesday, October 4th, 1927. This is one day before game one. The Yankees arrive at Forbes Field, and they get there to they get there to kind of get used to the field and kind of get some reps in, get some batting practice in. And according to the great Bambino himself, he said that the series was decided right then and right there at that very practice. He says, quote, "We won the World Series before it even got started. Naturally, we showed up a day early and worked out in this strange park, and we won the series during that workout. We really put on a show. Lou and I banged ball after ball into the right field stands, and I finally knocked one out of the park in right center. Muso and Tony Lazzari kept homering balls into the left field seats. One by one, the Pirates got up and left the park. Some of them were shaking their heads. When we last saw them, some of them were shaking their heads when we last saw them." That was a quote from Babe Ruth. So right here at this practice, they intimidate the crap out of Pittsburgh. And here's a quote I found from one Donnie Bush, who was the Pirates manager, on facing the New York in the World Series after seeing this batting practice. He goes, "Let's go out onto the ball field and hope we don't get killed." That's what he said about this. So Wednesday, October 5th, game one, you got Wade Hoyt versus the Pirates ace at the time, Ray Kramer. Yankees go up early in the first with the RBI triple from Garrett, and Babe Ruth's able to score. Pittsburgh kind of shows some fight. They answer back in the bottom of the first, so they go 1-1, and that score remained 1-1 until the third. Yankees were able to pick up 3 insurance runs. Pittsburgh would answer once again with a run in the bottom of the third, but then Yankees were able to sustain their lead, and they take game one with a Pitt struck first actually in this one with a run in the first, and Yankees actually remains Combs, Koenig, and Garrett all reached home to go up 3-1. Pip Grass, he got the start on the mound, and he was actually pretty solid for him that day. He allowed 6 hits in 7 innings, not bad. They kept Pittsburgh to just 2 runs in this one, and the Yankees would go on to win 6-2. So that puts them up 2-0 in this strange park, like Babe Ruth said. And so now they're going back to the Bronx and hopefully to finish this thing out on their turf. The very next day, Friday, October 7th, game 3, New York was like in complete control. They were kind of more in their element in this one. They're back home. They're in front of their home crowd, which was something around 41,000, I believe. Herb Pennock pitched a dandy of a game for him. This is, I talked about him before, and I said he'd come up again. He held the Pirates hitless through 7. He had a no-hitter going on all the way up into the 7th. Babe Ruth hits a 3-run bomb, and New York cruised to an 8-1 victory. Pennock pitched a 3-hitter and allowed no walks. It was a really good pitching performance from him. So now we go to the 4th game, Saturday, October 8th. The Yankees were looking to close this out and make quick work of Pittsburgh and just show everybody how dominant they were, that how Pittsburgh was the best that the National League had to offer. And we're going to show everybody that we're just going to make light work out of them. And this was nothing more than just like a practice run for them until they can find somebody with a little bit more of they can put up a little bit more of a fight, if you will. Huggins, the general manager, or the manager, he sent out Wilcie Moore to the mound. And each team, they struck in the first with a run. And the score was actually 1-1. It was pretty tight all the way up into the 5th. And Babe Ruth, in Babe Ruth fashion, knocks another home run. was the only 2 home runs in the entire World Series, both by Babe Ruth, naturally, of course. It's a 2-run blast. That was just, like I said, it's his second in the series. They go up 3-1. The Pittsburgh answers back with 2 in the 7th. So now we're going into the bottom of the 9th. The score is 3-3. You've got Combs and Koenig that are on third and second. And who's up to the plate? Babe Ruth. What a disaster if you're the pitcher in the World Series in the bottom of the 9th and you're hanging on for dear life. So what do? You freaking walk Babe Ruth. You have no other choice. So you walk Babe Ruth to bring up Lou Gehrig. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible position to be in. So they intentionally walk Babe Ruth, bases loaded for Lou Gehrig. And what happens? I think that the pressure gets to this guy's head. And so what he does is he throws a wild pitch, goes sailing past the catcher, and Combs is able to race home and scores. So the Yankees win the World Series off of a wild pitch. What a way to end the World Series. This is the only time World Series has ever been decided by a wild pitch. And with the Yankees doing it, they become the first American League team to sweep a National League team in the World Series. A few little fun facts about this World Series. The pitchers finished with a 2.00 ERA for the 4 games. The Yankees only trailed for 2 innings out of all 4 World Series games. They only used 4 pitchers. All 4 of them pitched complete games. And for the roster, they only had 15 people for the roster that actually played. And to this day, this is the quickest World Series from the opening pitch until that wild pitch that decided it, 74 hours and 15 minutes, which is what, 3 days total? Yeah. That's crazy. So that's how the 1927 World Series goes down.
Crazy, crazy, crazy. 4 games got it done for the postseason run in 27. Took a few more than that in 1998 due to the sheer fact that there was actually a playoffs to go through before they got the World Series. Tell me about the postseason run of the 1998 New York Yankees.
I should win just because of that fact. My team had to go through murder's row in the playoffs to win the World Series. We get to late September, early October. Darryl Strawberry, of course, had the colon cancer diagnosis, so they were missing one of their key contributors. They face off against the Texas Rangers in the division series. Now, the Texas Rangers in 1998 had the AL MVP, Juan Gonzalez, who was probably juicing as well, if you look at his stats, along with everybody else. Now, the Yankees made quick work of the Texas Rangers, sweeping them in 3 games, and this sets up their kryptonite from the previous year, the Cleveland Indians. Imagine Cleveland being anybody's kryptonite. But for the New York Yankees, they still felt the sting from 97. They felt like the Indians, that they should have beat them. They felt like the Florida Marlins were illegitimate champions. That's how some Yankee fans felt about the Marlins. So we get to the Cleveland Indians, the ALCS, and there was a little bit of controversy. In this game 2, there was a total fiasco involving your favorite player, Chuck Knobloch. Joe Torre called it a nightmare. He was arguing with an umpire. It cost them game 2. And they lost game 3. So we get to game 4, and they're trying to figure out, well, who are we going to put out to spare us from being put out by the Indians 2 years in a row? And George Steinbrenner goes to Joe Torre, and he says, hey, who are you going to put in? And he says, I'm going with Alduque. And George Steinbrenner was kind of perplexed. I mean, why are you going with him? I mean, we wanted to get Randy Johnson in the at the trade deadline from the Mariners, but he went to the Astros because you told me that when it came time to it, El Duque would come through in the clutch. And this is what Joe Torre tells George Steinbrenner. He says, I can tell you one thing. He's not going to be nervous because he's downstairs right now helping clear off dishes off the table in a team hotel. So this is how loose El Duque was in Game 4, and he pitched a gem. And he's going through Manny Ramirez, Jim Thome. I believe, wasn't David Justice on this
David Justice.
Indians team? Yeah, David Justice. This team was loaded. With a little help from El Duque, they even the series. They go on to beat the Cleveland Indians and exercise those demons from the previous year. Now, this is where I'm kind of hurt because the team they should have faced in the World Series is the Atlanta Braves. The team they got was the San Diego Padres. Tony Gwynn, Trevor Hoffman, Ryan Klesko, turncoat, Ryan Klesko. They did face some adversity with the San Diego Padres. In Game 1, they were down 5-2 before Mr. November himself, Chuck Knobloch, came through in the clutch. 3-run home run. Tino Martinez had a grand slam. They come back. They beat the Padres. They had to come back once again in Game 3. Scott Brosius hit a three-run home run off of Trevor Hoffman. If you want to talk about great years for closers, Trevor Hoffman's 98, 56 save season ranks up there. Eric Gagne comes to mind on great seasons for closers, but Trevor Hoffman, his best season, 98, he was untouchable. Scott Brosius hits a three-run home run. The Yankees go on to win the next game, finishing the sweep of the San Diego Padres. Like I said, the Atlanta Braves could have gave them a much better series than this, but the Braves had to choke away their first 2 games in the NLCS at Turner Field. The Yankees postseason record 11-2 in 1998, and this gives them 125 wins for the season, which is a MLB record today, and it will likely never be broken. With the parity that you have in baseball these days, well, heck, I mean, they're playing 50 or 60 game seasons now because of the pandemic. It's going to be a long time before you see a team accumulate 125 wins. The World Series MVP, not Derek Jeter, not any of the pitchers, not Bernie Williams, Scott Brosius, third baseman, unsung hero, gets the World Series MVP and completeness the World Series. They would go on to win in 99.
Crazily enough, I think it was my internet that was the mix-up this time. And I have to say that my internet is looking out for me tonight because you said earlier you were going to dispute how I was wrong when I said Derek Jeter was overrated, and it cut out and I couldn't hear you. So that was all well and good. And then just then I heard you speaking and you mentioned 1999, what they did, and then you froze on me. And the next thing I heard was 2001, which means it completely left out 2000. So I didn't have to hear you even mention that series. So my internet is on my side tonight because it's my computer that's recording. That will be lost forever to our viewers and listeners, which is perfectly fine with me. But we do, again, apologize for the technical difficulties. We live in a pandemic age, and, we rely on media and technology that doesn't always fail us. For the completeness and the cleanness of the show, it has failed us tonight. But for my sake and what I want you all to hear, it's editing at its finest. So with that being said, last point we're going to get to here tonight, this week, Mr. Elrod. Tell me about the legacy and how this 1998 New York Yankees team, how they're going to be remembered.
Well, when you think of great baseball dynasties, people our age, people our parents' age, they think of the Yankee dynasty of the 90s. That's the one that comes to mind. That's the most recent one. 4 championships. Could have been 5 or 6. Um, you look at the core of the team. They batted 288 as a complete team. They were first in the American League in runs scored. The team ERA was 382, which led baseball that year. Uh, Possessed the most dominant closer of all time, Mariano Rivera. He finished with 36 saves. Let's look at what other people have said about this Yankee team. Let's look at the baseball almanac. And what they did, which is pretty cool, they look at teams pre-World War II and post-World War II. And they do that because of a number of factors. And I'll get to that here in a second. But under their analysis of the post-World War II, and they put that year as 1947 when baseball fully came back, they have the 98 Yankees at number 1. And they rate teams pre-World War II, and Bennett's Yankees are number 1 for those years. When you group them together, Yankees, 98 Yankees comes out number 1. Lineups.com has, they do a similar thing when it comes to viewing teams from a post-World War II or pre-World War II era. Bennett's Yankees comes out, I believe, 14th in that poll. My team comes out 1, the 98 Yankees. And I'll leave you with this. 538, Nate Silver, he's famous for doing political prognostication in terms of who's going to win the Senate, who's going to win the presidency. He did a very interesting story a while back about why it's important to view baseball in a different eras. And it's got to do with expansion teams. There were 16 teams in Major League Baseball in 1927. 1927 Yankees had 15 other competitors. The 98 Yankees had 30 total teams, so they had 29 competitors. And Nate Silver does an analysis where he says, of course, you're going to have more stacked teams in the 20s, in the 30s, because you can't spread the talent out as much as you can later on when there's more teams. But even if you do group everybody together, this, under his analysis of best lineups, best teams, the 98 Yankees are 5th all time when he grouped everything together. Now, I will say that the next closest post-World War II team is the Baltimore Orioles of 1980. And the Big Red Machine was 23rd. The Yankee teams of the later years, the 27, the 32, and I think the 39 are on the top 5 in Nate Silver's analysis. But it's important to note these teams are more stacked because you don't have the competition, you don't have the gauntlet you have to run, and you don't have all the talent where you have to spread it out. This Yankee team in modern day baseball, with the parity that you have with you having to spread out the talent more, still comes in the top 5 of all time in his analysis. And that, my friend, is the reason why this team will be remembered as the best Yankee team of all time. When you do the analytics, it spits out this team is 1, 2, or 3 every single time, even with those earlier Yankee teams and teams in Major League Baseball.
Bennett, what is the legacy and how has history remembered the 1927 Yankees?
Yeah. First, before I get into that, a couple things. One, all right, I love that you found the one yahoo in all of those polls who ranked the 27 Yankees 14th. I looked at all those polls too. I saw that. I don't know what that guy's on. I don't know what the 27 Yankees did to him, but I saw all those. But the legacy of the 27 Yankees, obviously we know they're famously known as Murderers Row. They're known for the eye popping records that they set during the season, the records they set during the postseason, both hitting and pitching, and these records held up through time. Look at Babe Ruth's record that held for 34 years before somebody finally came along and broke that. And some of these other records that held up over time. Look at all the batting averages and such. But I want to look at one thing. They're widely regarded as number one on the greatest team of all time. And I want to emphasize that word team. I want to focus on that because for them, it wasn't about the personal stats or the individual achievements. It was just going out there and winning. I think you see a lot of today where you have the guys that come out and they're playing the game, but it's like, oh, I need 3 more hits today and I'll be able to bump my average up. Or I need 2 more home runs and I'll be first before the All-Star break, blah, 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 whatever. What's unique about them is they they all come from such a, a wide array of different like backgrounds, different educations, different personalities, different skill sets, and even different hobbies off the field. Lou Gehrig was widely known as a mama's boy, and that he would be extremely shy around the presence of women, which is polar opposite to his counterpart Babe Ruth, who was he enjoyed the company of women, and he wasn't so much of a shy, quiet mama's boy type. And even look at like Babe Ruth's background, where he came from. You've got some of these guys that were rookies, 30-year-old rookies. You've got guys that were at the very end of their career. You've got guys that were very, very sick that were still out there playing. You've got guys that are in the prime of their years. You've got a whole array, and they're all looking to do one thing, and they did that really, really well. You've got Ruth and Gehrig seasons. They were historic. Ruth's WAR that year was a 12.5, which is the third highest ever of the history of Major League. And Lou Gehrig's was 11.8, which is seventh all time. We're talking about 2 guys that had 2 of the top 7 WARs of anybody that's ever played in the history of baseball. Going back to the 1800s, going forward to 2019, 2 of the best in the top 7. They won the 110 games, which is 4th most ever. You have the 1906 Cubs and the 2001 Mariners that both won 116. Cubs lost in the World Series. Mariners didn't quite make it to the World Series. So I'm counting them out. You had the 1954 Indians that won 111, but they were swept in the World Series. The 98 Yankees, they did win 114, but they played 162. So I think if you compare that to the 154 games that the 27 Yankees have, that's 8 different games that the Yankees, I'm sure the 27 Yankees would love to play 8 more games to see if they could, what they could do to hold up to that record. And knowing them and knowing the kind of ego that they had on themselves, I'm sure that they would, which I'll get into that in a second. Wade Hoyt, the ace pitcher that we had for the Yankees, he said this about that group of men in 1927. You must understand that Huggins, that was the manager, developed as a manager in the same way that the ball players developed. He handled every player differently. And by 1927, one of the things that inadvertently meshed was the personalities of the fellows playing on that club. We all got along. We had inordinate pride in ourselves as a unit. When we were challenged, when we had to win, we stuck together and played with a fury and determination that can only come from team spirit. We had pride in our performance that was very real. It took on the form of snobbery. We felt we were superior people And I do believe we left a heritage that became a Yankee tradition. So when you get that stereotype of the Yankees thinking that they're number one and they're the best of the best, I think it starts right here with this squad right here. They kind of laid down that framework and that tradition that the Yankees kind of follow even today. So in a year where they're setting records and they're leading in all the statistical categories, they never lost focus or got wrapped up in any of these personal accolades that they did, the murderers row and the pitching staff. They were just a unit with one same goal, and that was sheer dominance. And that's what they did.
Bennett, closing argument. I don't have any follow ups tonight. Closing argument. Convince me that the 1927 Yankees are the greatest World Series winning team of all time.
When I was coming up with my closing arguments, I get on my Google machine and I type in greatest World Series team of all time, and post after post after post after post comes up. A lot of them do have the 27 Yankees as number one. Some of them don't. But I'm not going to sit here and bore you with every single little poll that somebody puts up that says that this team's better or this team's better. What I'm going to talk about is the 1927 Yankees as a World Series winning team is the greatest team ever assembled. Four positional players in the Hall of Fame. I think that was Combs, Lazari, Ruth, and Gehrig. Two pitchers in the Hall of Fame, and also the manager in the Hall of Fame. They had a positive 376 run differential on their opponents. Of course, we know they went 110 and 44. They had an ERA combined of 3.20, a combined batting average of 307. Koenig's 285, which is great. That bumped them down, or they would be probably in the 330s if it wasn't for that 285 mark. Nothing against him, but that bumped them down to 307. As a unit, they had a 498 slugging percentage, which is still to this day the best of all time. You also have the 158 home runs that they hit collectively as a unit. The number two team in the American League hit 56 home runs as a collective unit. So that's 102 more than their counterpart in the American League. That is absurd. They absolutely ran away with the pennant. They crushed everybody. They dominated nearly every single statistical category, not just in hitting. They also dominated a lot in the pitching. You had the 1-2 punch I talked about with Ruth and Gehrig, who both statistically put up all-time historical seasons for anybody that's ever played. As a team, they set numerous records that we've talked about. In the postseason, they were undefeated, the first American League team to sweep a World Series. And like I talked about, they only trailed in 2 innings in the entire World Series. You have to keep in mind that these stats they put up and that the talent that they possessed in this lopsided regular season and how dominant they were in the World Series was far, far, far superior to their competition of the time in 1927. John Kiernan of the a New York Times reporter said this about the New York Yankees from 1927, talking about the pennant race. He said it wasn't a race in the American League; it was a landslide. 93 years later, we still remember this legendary group of men and the fear that they imposed on their opponents and the historical significance that they represent in baseball history. And when you look at all this, in my opinion, makes them the greatest World Series team of all time.
Elrod, convince me that it's the 98 Yankees.
This is going to be very short and sweet. Allow me to do a screen share, right? If you don't mind.
So difficult.
So difficult. That's why I'm here, to make
It's
your life
not food
hard.
exclusive. You're gonna have to tell our listeners what we're about to
Yes, so we are about to do a screen share here of a very important newspaper article.
All right. You should be able to share.
Second.
hope it's about Forrest Gump.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Let's try this. Let's go here, 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 here. You see that?
I do.
All right. New York Daily News is one of the toughest um, publications on their home teams anywhere. If you do anything in New York, you are going to, anything wrong, anything improper, you're going to get crucified by the New York Daily News. This was the New York Daily News after they swept the Padres. Greatest team, greatest Yankee team, greatest Major League Baseball team of all time. And it's for the reasons we talked about earlier. It's the lineup, 1 through 9. It's the bench. It's the pitching. It's the bullpen. It's the coaching staff. You didn't have anybody on this team hitting 40 or 50 home runs. You didn't have that. You had a team that was going to nickel and dime you all day long. And more often than not, beat you and come away with the victory. We talked about the players. We talked about the wins. No disrespect to Babe Ruth, Gehrig, that bunch. Babe Ruth and Gehrig ate and hitting the Mariano Rivera cut fastball. This is one thing about baseball and golf that's unique. You can compare basketball players. You can compare tennis players. It's very difficult to compare older baseball players and older golfers because the dimensions of the stadiums are much different than they were in the past. Golf courses are different. It's also the equipment, the bats, the balls that have totally changed over time. So it's very difficult to say what X would do with Y 80 years later. But I do know one thing. Babe Ruth's big butt is not hitting Mariano Rivera's cut fastball going 95, 96 miles an hour. It's not happening. Not going to happen. Hate to say it. 98 Yankees. Just ask the boss. God rest his soul. George Steinbrenner. What is the best team of all time? He was probably around in 20. Oh, his old butt probably was. He wasn't. But he would tell you the 98 Yankees was the anchor team of the greatest baseball dynasty. As bad as I hate to say it, of all time, it's got to be the 98 Yankees.
Gentlemen, both of you have presented compelling arguments. As bad as I hate to say it, there are two very, very good New York Yankees teams laid out in front of me here. Elrod, you didn't flub your argument. Good job. You're getting better about that. And when I look at these, there is a lot of differences. It's almost impossible a lot of times to compare eras. It really is. When you look top to bottom, from your top guy to the what we would call the lowest rated person on your bench, my thought would be that it would be the 98 Yankees in that sense. But a lot of that has to do with I wasn't around in 1927. I know the big names from 97. I don't know your average everyday players from 27 like I know the 1998 Yankees because there's that bit of recency bias there, and there's that part of me that saw the 98 Yankees with my own eyes. Whereas history, a little bit of footage, I didn't see the 1927 Yankees, obviously. When you look at that, I would give the nod probably to 98. When you look at the top of that list, it's not even close. when you look at 27 versus 98, because Ruth and Gehrig is probably the best 3-4 slot 1-2 punches ever. Period. You make your arguments for the greatest baseball player of all time. Both of those names are going to come up. Much less having them batting back to back, like Bennett said the scenario. You intentionally walk Ruth to get to Gehrig. It's a no-win situation. There was not that with the 98 Yankees. There were great baseball players on the 98 Yankees, but nobody on that team came close to Ruth or Gehrig as far as what they were when we look at the greatest baseball players of all time. Your arguments, honestly, are really close. So, in a sense, I kind of have to defer my judgment to others. And I say what I mean by that is this. You all know, our regular listeners, viewers know, I like to go see what other people think. Bennett talked about you type in Google, you type in the greatest teams of all time. And when you look at those lists, both of these teams are consistently on here. They're there with the 39 Yankees. They're there with the 06 Cubs, the 09 Pirates, 1909. 1909.
Say 1909. Last time they were good.
Yeah. So, but I looked at the first few that popped up. I wasn't going to go in and look at everyone, but just for instance, if you look at a Bleacher Report poll or Bleacher Report article on who's the greatest baseball team of all time, number one on that list is the 1927 Yankees, and the 98 Yankees are number 4. You look at the Fueled by Sports ranking, however, and the 1998 Yankees are number 1. 1927 Yankees are number 9 on that list, which is by far the lowest I saw them. Apparently, I didn't see the one that had them ranked at 14. Sportscasting poll had them ranked as number 1 and number 2, with 27 Yankees being number 1, 98 Yankees being number 2. The one I found that was most interesting, and Elrod, I thought you were going here earlier. 538 did something back in 2016, looking at the best teams of all time according to an ELO score. An ELO composite score, and I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of what an ELO score is. I know a lot of times it's used to determine the skill of like a chess player, things like that, but they did it to compare the greatest baseball teams of all time. It has to do with the relative strengths of team across the skill on that team, the success of that team, the level of opponents that team played. And they took the time to go through, let me see, when did they start? From 1903 to 2015. Over 2,300 teams in the history of baseball they broke down and gave them a composite ELO score. Number 1 on this list is neither of these teams, but it is the New York Yankees. It's the 1939 Yankees. Which is another team that could have easily been argued here. Number 2 on this list is the Chicago Cubs from 1906. One of these two teams tonight was ranked number 3 with a composite score of 1610. One of these teams was tied for 4th with a composite score of 1609. So 1 point difference here. By the slightest of margins.
Before you get hold on. Before you give your verdict, I want to say something about this poll. Nate Silver and his team acknowledged that this ELO was very much slanted toward those early 19 or 20th century MLB teams because of the competition. The fact that the '98 Yankees are even near those teams says how strong they are.
I don't deny that. They're very worthy. Both these teams are worthy, but I think an argument you tried to use to your advantage did the opposite for me in this. And maybe it wouldn't to all of our viewers and listeners, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners will have a different opinion, and I hope they let us know. But your talk of expansion team and expanding that talent out, when there's fewer teams, there's more talent on one team, and maybe that favors the Yankees because they have more talent. But the teams they were playing also had more talent in that time span. By the slightest of margins, Bennett, you have convinced me that the 1927 Yankees, with a 1 point ELO score difference, is the greatest team of all time, other than the '86 Mets, which no one will ever convince me of otherwise.
Well, since you obviously both of these teams were good in their own ways, different philosophies, but since you did give me the win, I'm gonna give us a convince me exclusive and explain why Lou Gehrig got the MVP instead of Babe Ruth, where Babe Ruth was number one in every single, nearly number one in every statistical category. If he wasn't one, he was number two. And the reason, and actually before I get into that, both of these men came very, very close to winning the Triple Crown. It was almost like Ruth got in Gehrig's way and Gehrig got in Ruth's way from them achieving this Triple Crown. But if you're like, well, Babe Ruth had one of the greatest seasons of all time, why did he not get MVP? It's because he won the MVP in 1926, and at the time, they had a rule that states that you can't win it consecutive years, so they gave it to Gehrig.
Wow.
That is why Lou Gehrig was the MVP of 1927 and not Babe Ruth. A very stupid rule, in my opinion.
That's what I was about to say. No disrespect to Lou Gehrig, but that's a stupid rule.
It is. And one thing about this episode that I really enjoyed is exactly what you touched on. We lived through the '98 Yankees, so we know all about that team and what they went through to win the World Series. We don't know much about this 27 squad, so I'm really fascinated about um, learning history about baseball and learning about some of these players way before our time. So I thoroughly enjoyed going through and kind of looking at some of these men that I honestly haven't heard of, a lot of them, and how great they were. It was really, really fascinating to dig into and learn a little bit about these gentlemen and their backgrounds too, like how they all banded together to make this team. Really fascinating.
Yeah, it's something. I was trying hard to fight against that bias because when you look at the not superstars, really good players, not superstars, I don't know who those guys were in 27. Whereas you look at somebody that 90 years from now, people aren't going to know who El Duque was. He was the number 5 starter on a World Series winning team. I freaking loved El Duque, even if he was a Yankee. He later became a Met. He sucked as a Met, which is, par
Par for the course.
jinx. Yes, exactly. But I love Del Duque. People in 90 years aren't going to know who El Duque is. Um, there's probably somebody similar to that on the 27 Yankees that if I were around, I would have loved that guy. Living when I do, I have no clue who it is. So it's kind of hard to fight that, I guess what you would call recency bias, personal experience bias. Um, because just looking at these teams, I want to go 98 just because I remember how good that 98 team was. But I have to remember I didn't see 27, and I have to go with what the numbers say. So, but very very good arguments. And we hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I know it was Bennett's favorite episode.
It's definitely one of my favorites.
So we appreciate you guys for joining us. We hope you'll come back next week. Don't know what we're talking about yet, but I'm sure that it will be fascinating and fun. Elrod, you look a little dejected. You got any parting words?
Hey, it's Choptober. Go Braves. Screw the Yankees. They're at the house watching the Braves this time. Reversal of fortunes.
Well, there you go. I will. It's October, so baseball season is typically over for me by now, and such is the case this year. Which is why I'm glad we can look back at these classic years. Bennett, do you have anything else to add before we sign off?
Chop on.
Chop on. I hate to say this, but of the teams left, I'm rooting for the Rays. But, Braves would be second on that list. I would definitely root for the Braves over the Dodgers or the Astros. So there we go. But we hope you guys will come back and join us next week. We hope you'll join us every week. We hope you'll follow us on our socials. We hope that you will tell all your friends to like us, listen to our show. Mr. Bennett, you have convinced me that the 27 Yankees are the greatest World Series team of all time, and we hope we have convinced you that you want to come back next week. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you then. Peace.